When I was in second grade, my grandma gave me a book by Billy Goodman called A Kid's Guide to How to Save the Planet, and I've been a self-proclaimed environmentalist ever since. As an 8-year-old, I didn't even know the planet needed saving, but that book was full of facts and statistics, graphs and charts about our planet's dwindling natural resources, endangered animals, and global warming. That gift from my grandma changed me in 3 major ways. I started to become more aware of the issues in the world, I became more curious and started to ask more questions, and ultimately, I started to care more about the world around me and how I interacted with it. These 3 changes helped me become a good citizen of the world. As a 6th grade teacher, I call these elements the ACE elements: awareness, curiosity, and empathy. And I use them to help the young citizens in my classroom understand their role in a changing world. Let's begin with the first element, awareness. Our students need to be aware of what is happening in the world, no matter whether it impacts them directly or not. One way that I've helped students foster an awareness of global issues is by making sure I carefully connect the content of each lesson to the real world. For every unit, I have some version of anchor charts on display that we use continuously in my classroom. They might be physical anchor charts hanging in the classroom, or I'll use a digital version like Padlet, Jamboard, or even Flipgrid. Throughout our unit, I ask my students to connect what they're learning in the classroom to what's happening in the world around us. When I was teaching my students about early humans, they connected the problem-solving and innovative skills of early humans making stone tools to Steve Jobs making Apple products. During our Ancient Civilizations unit, one student connected abuse of power by an emperor to police brutality today. To connect our book club unit to modern issues, we made sure each book centered around different current social issues: racism, ableism, gender inequality, domestic violence. And we spent time as a class discussing each issue and how they are present in our world beyond the pages of the books. Throughout the unit, in their book club discussions and on their digital notebook, that social issue was a major focus. And part of their expectation was to find a recent, no older than 2 years, article from the news about that particular issue. After reading Front Desk by Kelly Yang, one student found an article about police being called on innocent people of color who were doing nothing wrong. Another brought an article about the model minority issue. But connecting historical lessons to the present isn't enough. I want to help my students make personal connections to events that happened long ago or events that are happening far away to people very different from them. Making these big ideas and global issues personal is even harder given the context of my classroom. I teach 6th grade in the United Arab Emirates. But as expats, they're from many different places. Their attention and focus is often in different parts of the world, so I work to make issues around the world relevant to them. When I woke up on the morning of January 7th to the news of the Capitol Hill riot, I knew I had to talk to my students about it, because this was a pivotal moment in history. As expected, few of my students even knew what had happened, so I summarized it as best I could. I gave my students space and time to react and ask questions, making it clear that I was not going to have all the answers. It was more of an open forum than a structured lesson. After giving them time for that, I brought this event back to them. I made it personally tangible. I told my students this event was a prime example of how impactful power is, especially the power of words. I said this riot occurred because people believed the words of someone in power. And then I asked my students to share stories of times someone's words had made them feel terrible and times when someone's words had made them feel unstoppable. I encouraged my students to think about the power they have, albeit limited at their young age, but they do have power within themselves, in the classroom, within their friend groups, and even within their families. I closed by encouraging them to always use their power and the power of their words for the greater common good. I said they needed to use their power to build others up, not tear them down. By raising awareness of this particular issue, I was also raising awareness of their role and responsibility in preventing similar events in the future, in their future. So that's the A in ACE. Next up is the C, curiosity. In raising awareness of issues, our students are naturally going to become more curious. I tell my students they need to be lifelong learners, and that I'm also a lifelong learner. I work with my students a lot on how to push and expand their knowledge. When my students say, there are 3 Chinese philosophies, I have them add, I wonder what other nation had multiple philosophies, or I wonder which of those philosophies had the biggest impact. In doing this, my students are taking what they learned and building onto it with a question or a wondering that's going to push them to learn and explore more. This encourages them to reach further in their thinking and learning. KWL charts where students fill in what they know about a subject, what they wonder about that subject, and what they learned, this is filled in after the lesson, are great ways to push their curiosity. I like to use those at the beginning of the lesson, but then I go back to that same chart at the end of the lesson, and I have my students fill in what they learned, but also what they're still wondering. They can definitely add to the knowledge part, but I need them to understand that just because they learned what they were supposed to doesn't mean that that's the end of their wondering. They need to keep asking questions and keep finding out more about that topic. I tell my students all the time, you don't know what you don't know, and that's very true for me as well. On the first day of Ramadan this year, my daily attendance question was, what do you like or enjoy about Ramadan? I told my students that I know not all of them celebrate Ramadan, but that it's really important to appreciate the beauty of others' cultures and religions. To help my non-Muslim students come up with an answer, I had them use the chat function and type in a question they had about Ramadan, reminding them that they could take what they already know and turn it into an I wonder statement. Instead of saying, I know Muslims fast, put in, I wonder why Muslims fast. I then asked my Muslim students to pick a question to answer. It was wonderful conversation. They were learning and growing in curiosity and sharing stories. I loved hearing both my Muslim students and non-Muslim students talk about their favorite part of a religious tradition that they may or may not take part in. Each story or answer that was shared sparked more questions and wonderings, so I made a Padlet for the class for my students to access and jot down their questions and for other students to be able to answer. All of my students had access to the Padlet and they could go back whenever they wanted to. Through awareness and curiosity, my students are gaining an understanding of the experiences of others, which leads them to growing in empathy, the third of the ACE elements. Empathy is such an important trait to instill in our students. It builds trust and respect, ensures peace, and creates safe spaces, all qualities of a conscientious young citizen. On the first day of school each year, as part of my introduction, I talk about empathy, how it's one of the biggest skills that they're going to learn through reading, and how it's one of the biggest skills employers look for in this modern global world. One of the best ways I encourage empathy in my classroom is by being intentional in the stories we read, listen to, watch, and share, and with the types of questions I ask. In everything I choose to teach in my classroom, I make sure my students are being represented as much as possible, which is so important in such a diverse classroom. Sometimes my students see themselves as one group, as the expat group, and that can cause their individual differences and cultures to kind of get lost. And having so much of the content in my classroom being full of representation of everyone in my room, it exposes my students to how unique they each are and to experiences completely outside their frame of reference. Something I say to my students very often is, your normal is not everybody else's normal, and our students really need to be challenged in that kind of thinking. One of my favorite stories to read with 6th graders is The Circuit by Francisco Jimenez. The Circuit is a short story from a collection of memoirs by the same name, and they all center around Jimenez's childhood as a migrant worker in America. Before reading the story, I asked my students, what was the hardest work you've ever had to do? I have them do some silent thinking for a little while, write down and brainstorm ideas, and then share those with the class. After that, I move into very specific questions directly related to the story. I ask questions like, have you ever had to work 12 hours a day with very few breaks? Have you ever had to do physically hard labor in the sun? Have you ever moved 2 or 3 times in one school year? Have you ever been responsible for helping your family make money so that you can survive? Framing my questions that way not only gives my students an idea of what the story is that we're going to read, but it helps them understand that the kind of work they had experienced or thought about was not the kind of work that Francisco Jimenez has experienced. Their normal is not his normal. I want to add here that I make sure my students don't feel ashamed because they haven't experienced what Francisco Jimenez experienced. I tell them they shouldn't feel bad that they haven't had to work that hard. Rather, they should recognize how fortunate they are and understand that others sometimes aren't that fortunate. In doing so, and having that conversation and asking those questions, my students gain a deeper appreciation for the experiences of others. The next thing I do with this story is I always pair it with a story my father wrote just for my classroom, because he was also a migrant worker as a young boy. My students love this. It's one thing for them to read about an experience by an author who's far removed from them, but it's quite another to hear an experience from someone so close. I talk about how the life and treatment of migrant workers is very personal to me, and then I teach them about heroes in the migrant community like Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez. Doing that encourages empathy while also raising awareness and promoting curiosity. These ACE elements work so well hand in hand and are so interconnected. At the end of the school year, we as educators need to be okay with our students not remembering every detail of River Valley civilizations or poetic devices. What we need to be more concerned about is that they leave our classrooms wiser, more mature, kinder, more empathetic, more understanding. Yes, we need to expose them to facts according to the standards, but also experiences according to the lives of others. By doing this, by challenging the way our students think, by getting them to learn and wonder and look outside of themselves, we are creating good young citizens. And we are laying the foundation for creating good global citizens, citizens who are open-minded and emotionally and culturally intelligent. We need to work hard, as Jorge Santos, a restorative justice coordinator and special ed teacher in New York says, to prepare our students for the world as it is and give them the tools to create the world as they want it to be. By using the ACE elements and showing our students how interconnected awareness, curiosity, and empathy are, it allows us to prepare them to be the young citizens that our world needs.